Okay, I'm going to be honest here. This debate has been going on since the 1990s, but it is an important one, and today we're going to do a mega deep, super deep, huge deep dive into what the actual verdict is. And of course, the argument here in the debate is Nirvana's Nevermind the best album, or is In Utero slightly better? We're going to go into all aspects of this, a deep history, so strap in, hit that like button, and subscribe if you like the content you're getting here. And without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so before we get started, it is important to note that I'm doing this in one long, uninterrupted take, so please forgive any slight ad-libs or mistakes or throat clears or whatever else I have to do here to get through this in one long take. I think Kurt would have wanted that way because he doesn't like, supposedly at least didn't like fakeness and too much polishing and too much slick production. So, nevertheless, here we go. So Nirvana is one of the rare bands where the argument never really ends. Not about whether they mattered, not about whether they were good, but about which version of them, if you will, was real or best. Was Nirvana at their best when they accidentally conquered the world with Nevermind? Or was Nirvana at their best when they tried to tear that world apart with In Utero? Because those two albums don't just sound different, they believe in different things. And to understand why this debate has lasted more than 30 years, we have to go back to a time before the fame, before the pressure, before the expectations. We have to start with an album that often gets left out of the conversation entirely, actually, and that album is called Bleach. Before Nirvana was a cultural earthquake, they were just another loud, uncomfortable band from the Pacific Northwest. Bleach came out in 1989 on Sub Pop, which in itself, that was a miracle for a number of reasons, but the album was recorded for a little over $600, and you can hear every penny of that budget, because the album doesn't sound clean, it doesn't sound friendly, and it definitely doesn't sound like it wants to be loved. I think, not to go off on a tangent here, but in many ways, Bleach is simultaneously Kurt at his most pure, and Kurt also trying his hardest to fit in. Because I think songs like About a Girl are clearly what he probably liked, but then songs like, Big Cheese, Mr. Mustache, he really wanted to get on a label and he really wanted to fit in with bands that were on Sub Pop or albums like that, labels like that. And the fuzz tone is like insane, especially if you go back to like the Fecal Matter demos and just what he was doing even before Bleach. It's so raw, but clearly he wanted it to sound like that. So that should be noted here because when Bleach was recorded, especially even before it was released, this is all they had. I mean, this was Kurt, homeless almost, penniless, poverty-stricken, no adoration, no love from the fans, really. No huge net worth, no mansion, no fame. So this is what he wanted to do, and he practiced a lot to get it like that. So that should be noted here first. So Bleach is heavy in a way that feels oppressive rather than exciting. The guitars are thick, sludgy, repetitive. The drums are blunt, the bass kinds of grinds away instead of grooving along. And what's most notable here, I think, is Kurt's voice isn't the melodic, wounded howl most people associate with Nirvana. It's way harsher, it's more distant, sometimes almost buried. And this is Kurt before irony became his shield of what he would do with his songs. And also, interestingly here, Kurt doesn't really, one of his ideas, I believe, originally was take off all the treble for the guitars and that sort of thing to make it sound like Black Sabbath, basically. And you can hear that obviously that didn't work out, but just the very idea of it, and I think he tried the same thing with Nevermind too, is he wanted it to be lo-fi. He wanted it to be less than perfect sounding, which coming out of the 80s and what mainstream rock was, I think he wanted to be counterculture in that aspect. So, but anyway, songs like Blue, Negative Creep, and School aren't trying to hook you, although they do have hooks, They're trying to push you away, to a degree. They're trying to be confrontational, they're trying to be abrasive, dissonant, And that's intentional here. At this point, Nirvana is still deeply rooted in the underground. Kurt idolizes bands like the Melvins and Black Sabbath. You can hear it everywhere. There's slow tempos on Bleach, the crushing riffs, the obsession with heaviness for its own sake. There's anger here, clearly. I mean, a song like Paper Cuts and that sort of stuff, it's not hard to hear the anger, but it's unfocused. It's not coherently delivered. It's not really, maybe, I would argue, that well thought out compared to further things that they would do. For the time, it's still extremely thought out that one man could write all these riffs, sing all these songs, write all these lyrics, and even in some cases do the drum and bass parts, arrangement-wise, not playing them, but, showing the players what to play. That's incredible. I mean, that's very rare. But in terms of what they did later, this is like minor league Nirvana in some ways. So there's alienation here, but it hasn't yet found its key language that would connect with everyone. And in a way, Bleach is like a band searching for identity, but already knowing one thing for sure: they do not want to be part of the mainstream rock world of the late 1980s. I mean, I think not only did they not want that, I think that was an impossibility given what they were recording at the time. So we got to remember, in the time period, hair metal is still dominant over everything. Virtuosity is prized. If you could play tapping solos and hit a lot of notes, hit them cleanly, that was what people wanted. Excess is celebrated. I mean, the 80s is probably the most decadent decade of all time in some ways. And Bleach rejects all of it. I mean, there's glimpses of melody here, mostly on About a Girl. That stands out immediately. But even that song feels like a fluke, almost like out of place on the record. And that's important because Bleach establishes the tension that will define Nirvana's entire career. The tension, obviously, between noise and melody, Black Sabbath, the Melvins, and like the Beatles. Between sincerity and sarcasm, between wanting to be heard and wanting to disappear. Because without Bleach, Nevermind doesn't happen. It's sold very well, which is able to get them, the attention of major labels later on, along with the Smart Session demos. And without Bleach, In Utero doesn't really make any sense. So this album is the soil that everything else grows out of, and it's important that we touch on that really quickly. But now, let's shift gears, get to the meat and potatoes of things, because by 1990, things definitely started to change. Chad Channing, who actually was doing a pretty good job, but most would argue his jazzy type drumming doesn't really fit the powerhouse sound of Nirvana. He leaves the band, so Chad Channing is out, and Dave Grohl joins, and Dave Grohl was coming from a band called Scream, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about Dave Grohl's drumming. I mean, it's heavy, it's exactly on time, he's never sloppy, but it's like massively heavy. It would be like listening to Led Zeppelin before John Bonham was in it, and I know that probably never happened, but if you took John Bonham out of that band and replaced him with another drummer, it wouldn't sound the same. And the same thing is definitely true of Dave Grohl here. So that cannot be overstated. He doesn't just play the drums, he's like basically attacking them. His playing on these songs adds weight, momentum, and most importantly, very big dynamics. And Kurt was starting to get really into the Pixies around this time, and he admitted that he stole the dynamics basically from the Pixies, where they would have a super loud chorus and a quiet verse. And that's, after Bleach, what Kurt really started to get into. So suddenly, with that change in the songwriting and Dave's playing and the types of songs Kurt was listening to really and emulating, Nirvana sounds a lot bigger all of a sudden. Because at the same time, like I said, Kurt's songwriting sharpens, the melodies get clearer, the contrasts get more extreme, quiet verses, explosive choruses, and this is where Nirvana, the formula, really begins to crystallize. And it leads directly into the album that would change everything. So here we go, Nevermind. When Nirvana enters the studio to record Nevermind, no one involved thinks they're making a generation-defining record. They're just trying to make something cleaner than Bleach. I mean, and that's a little bit understated, but the fact is Nirvana recorded the Smart Sessions with Butch Vig, and that demo got them major label deal, basically. Those songs are very strong. And it's important to note that the songs that Kurt did not have on there because he hadn't recorded them yet, I don't even know that he had written them yet, to be honest. Come As You Are, Smells Like Teen Spirit were not on the Smart Sessions. Neither was Something in the Way. I believe On a Plane also wasn't on there. And a few other ones. And then songs like Stay Away were actually Pay to Play back then. That had a lyric change later. And Breed, I believe, was still called Imodium on the Smart Sessions, but not all of Nevermind was put down as the Smart Sessions with Butch Vig around this time. the key songs, in fact, I would argue, were not even on there. Smells Like Teen Spirit, Come As You Are aren't on that, studio demo. But the rest of the songs were strong enough, and the sales of Bleach, to get the attention of major labels. And ultimately, they went with the David Geffen Company because Sonic Youth was on there, and Sonic Youth really liked Nirvana and sort of hooked them up with some management and lawyers, and they thought it would be a safe move to go to David Geffen Company. And finally, they weren't in poverty, basically. I mean, they were just slightly above poverty because they only got like an advance and such. But Kurt especially knew that this was his chance. He knew that, like, if this didn't succeed, that'd be it, and he'd probably be pumping gas or being a janitor, which he was before Nevermind, for a living, and that would be it. So he really, I know he never came right out and admitted it, but if you read his journals, it's very clear the amount of planning and forethought that went into this. There was even a discussion of a boy and a girl side of Nevermind at first, meaning all the softer poppy songs would be on one side and all the heavier sides would be on another. And that would have been interesting, but obviously that's not what he went with. So, tangent over, let's get back onto focus here a little bit. So that choice, like I said, to clean things up for the mainstream just enough, ends up changing the entire trajectory of rock music as we know it. And as I mentioned, Nevermind was produced by Butch Vig, and it sounds massive, basically, compared to Bleach. The guitars are still distorted, but they're controlled. The drums are explosive, but they're precise. Kurt's vocals this time sit front and center, very big change. Vulnerable and confrontational at the same time. And this is where Nirvana really finds the balance. The songs are catchy without being polished in a total way, aggressive but they're not inaccessible, and angry without being incoherent. And of course, the song that matters the most from this album in terms of commerciality, sales, and fame, all that stuff, Smells Like Teen Spirit. At this point, the song is so overplayed, so mythologized, that it's easy to forget how strange of this song how strange it is. The opening riff isn't flashy, it's simple, almost stupidly simple, but it hits like a sledgehammer, because when that song breaks into the mainstream, it doesn't just introduce Nirvana to the world, it introduces the world to itself, because suddenly all these millions of kids who were basically ignored, bored or disconnected, they hear something that sounds like how they feel. And rock music has never been the same since, honestly. So, Nevermind, let's get into the songs themselves. If Nevermind had only been culturally important, the argument would be easy. But the reason we're still talking about this album decades later is because the songs themselves hold up, even after being played to death, which God knows they are by now. Smells Like Teen Spirit opens the album, and in a way, it traps Nirvana inside it forever. The song isn't a manifesto, Kurt never intended it to be one. The lyrics are fragmented, sarcastic, and deliberately vague. Lines like, "Here we are now, entertain us," feel like a joke at first until you realize how accurately they predict the band's future. Kurt is mocking apathy, but he's also indicting himself. I mean, I could spend 30 minutes just talking about this song, but the real takeaways are here. It was written pretty close to when the album was recorded. It was very fresh. And the key, I think, I guess we'll start with the video. The video totally changed the landscape of MTV. Instead of seeming really corporate and clean and homogenized and smiling to the camera and holding up your guitar and playing the solo, it was like the opposite of that. It looked like a pep rally from hell, basically, which was the real pitch that Kurt basically gave, modeled after the 1979 movie Over the Edge with Matt Dillon, where the kids take over the high school in anarchy. But it was very important that the video connected with people, and Kurt knew that, to his credit, mostly because he'd probably fantasized about being a rock star for at least 10 years by that point. And the original cut by Sam Bayer is really stupid. You can look it up on YouTube, it's out there. There's a storyline about the janitor and the principal and stuff, and it's fine, but if they had released that version, the song would not have been nearly as big as it was, in my opinion, because it fits more into a 1980s video. There's a storyline, it's a pretty stupid storyline, has nothing to do with the band, and Kurt's looking at the camera a lot more, you're seeing his face a lot more. But what Kurt wisely did was cut all that out of there and he basically made it about the band performing with no close-ups and no vanity shots, and about the crowd going nuts when they heard the song and the people just taking over the video. The kids that were sitting there were moshing, and all that stuff was brand new at the time, for the mainstream culture at least. And you only see Kurt's face at the very end, and it's very intentional. He looks right at the camera, screaming at the camera, looking directly into the lens, and that, I think the song already, is taking off and is doing well the first 3-4 minutes, but then that ending is so powerful that you can't watch that and not instantly remember it and be hooked. So then the other part was that people just started requesting it. The hooks were so hooky and so loud and contagious, not to paraphrase the song, that it started getting requested on the radio so often that it just took over, even though it wasn't planned or pushed really. Record company people actually thought the later singles would be the ones that took off more, like Come As You Are, but it just was like a nuclear blast. Like, once Smells Like Teen Spirit was out there, the world was just genuinely not the same. So then we'll get to track 2. I know that was a little bit of a rant. In Bloom. In Bloom, my personal favorite Nirvana song, probably for a number of reasons, but this is one of the smartest songs Nirvana ever wrote, and it often gets overlooked because it's so catchy. In Bloom is about people who love the music but miss the point entirely, which arguably could be everyone when Nevermind came out. I mean, almost everyone, except for the really smart kids that got what Kurt was trying to do. People who sing along without listening, people who treat rebellion like a costume, which ironically is exactly what Nirvana encouraged when they got so popular. It's almost like he predicted what would happen before it happened. And supposedly the song is about Kurt's friend Dylan Carlson because he was one of those type of listeners. But the song itself is just like tremendous. It has the immediate hook, and then it has the bass part and the quiet verse, and then the loud, catchy chorus. And I think, actually, I don't have my computer in front of me here, but I believe In Bloom was probably the first song where Nirvana really had the formula down. And there's even a sub-pop version with the video and everything, and it's just like, once you hear that, you're like, okay, I get what this band's trying to do. But because before then, I mean, there was songs that were like, similar, that were around the same time, like Sliver and Dive and stuff, but In Bloom is really the one where you're like, okay, I get it, and this is going to be massive. So next on the album is Come As You Are. Everybody knows that song. It's so relentlessly catchy. It's actually pretty much ripped off from a song by Killing Joke called 80s, which Kurt knew and was worried about before they released it as a single. And they did get sued, but they settled with the band. But anyway, it slows things down. It's murky, moody, aquatic, deceptively calm. The guitar riff is very hypnotic, looping in over and over again. But lyrically, it's an invitation, one that comes without any judgment, but it does have contradictions. Come as you are, as you were, as I want you to be. It's acceptance wrapped in control, freedom wrapped in expectation. Come As You Are is a really underrated song, in some ways, not in terms of commerciality, but in terms of lyrics. It's basically Kurt's personality in like one song. It's filled with contradictions, and then of course the part where he says, I swear that I don't have a gun, became prophetic, unfortunately. But it just didn't sound anything like anything else that came out in 1991, and I can't overstate that watery guitar effect, which was enhanced by Andy Wallace's mixing on this album. It just sounds like amazing, and the video is really different and weird, and I think people hearing that right after Smells Like Teen Spirit, if they only watched MTV and like listened to singles and didn't buy the album, that probably hooked people even more. So then you get to Breed, and then Lithium. This is the emotional range of Nevermind starts to take off, and you really start to hear like the formula, for lack of a better word. Breed is frantic and claustrophobic, obsessed with routine and domestic pressure. Lithium, on the other hand, is restrained until it explodes, a song about mental instability, but it's disguised as like a pop anthem. I mean, these songs are like genius. To this day, you can put them on and you still won't be sick of them. And then Kurt screams, I'm not going to crack, over and over again, and the repetition makes it feel less like a statement and more like a plea because of the way he's singing. And again, you compare these songs to songs on Bleach, which only came out a few years prior, and it's like night and day different in terms of the songwriting. So then there's Drain You, which was Kurt's apparently favorite song on Nevermind, he claimed. And if there's a song that represents Nirvana at their best balance of melody, noise, humor, raw emotion, it might be Drain You. It's about obsession, intimacy, losing yourself inside another person. It's gross and tender at the same time. There's syringes, infections, dependence, all wrapped in one of the catchiest choruses they ever wrote. And then even the quieter moments on Nevermind, they still feel deliberate, like something in the way closes the album like a ghost drifting out of the room. It's a very haunting, creepy song, minimalist, fragile, almost unfinished. Doesn't feel like an ending, it feels like a warning, which would ultimately, that kind of was prophetic. I know I skipped a few songs, Lounge Act, Stay Away, Territorial Pissings, but those songs are also repeating the formula very well and have like even weirder lyrics in many ways. On a Plane is such a great song, though. That's when people still overlook that song because it wasn't a single or anything, but that is still one of the best melodies and just so seemingly tossed off, but it wasn't tossed off, and it just has this great sound to it and melody that is like you can't get it out of your head. Even if you hear it once, like you'll hear us sing it for the rest of the day. For a non-single song, that's like incredible. So anyway, moving on to more commercial talk. When Nevermind hits, it doesn't just slowly climb the charts. This thing like detonated like a nuclear bomb. By early '92, just 3 months after the album was released, Nirvana knocked Michael Jackson off the #1 spot. Now, this was a band that did not even have a record on a major label before that, so like that is insane for like so many reasons. But hair metal also collapses almost overnight as a result. Record labels are scrambling to find the quote next Nirvana, completely missing the irony of that idea. But suddenly, alternative rock is mainstream, flannel becomes fashionable, angst, of course, becomes marketable, discomfort becomes branding, and Kurt Cobain, supposedly, at least I didn't know the guy, I can't say for sure, but hates all of it. He doesn't hate success because he's pretentious, he hates it because he feels dishonest, he sees people projecting meanings onto his work that he never intended, and worse, he sees people he despises embracing the band. Sexists, homophobes, meathead rock fans, the very people his music was pushing against now wear Nirvana shirts. And obviously you could see why that would eat at him. I don't think Kurt hated fame quite as much as it made out to be. I think he was a very contradictory guy. Even on his journals it says, don't, dare read my journals, basically. And then the next sentence says, read my journals, try to help figure me out. Just a confused guy, which I think a lot of people can relate to. I think that's why the songs are so, they just stand the test of time, not only because of the catchy hooks and everything, but because of how conflicted the guy seemed to feel. I think a lot of people feel confused, and a lot of people feel they don't agree with things in the world, or they have a different viewpoint, or they feel alone, or they feel isolated, or they feel frustrated. And I think all of that is encapsulated on this album. It's just like amazing how he was able to distill it into such a mainstream way in many ways. So let's go into this a little bit. Kurt never wanted to be a symbol. He clearly wanted to be successful because he took all these steps to become successful, but I don't think he wanted to be quite as visible as he ended up being. Like, he wanted to be heard, not interpreted, not worshipped, and not commodified. But Nevermind, overnight, turns him into a reluctant spokesman for a generation, whether he likes it or not. Every interview becomes a battlefield, every performance feels scrutinized, every song is treated like a statement. So at the same time, unfortunately, his personal life begins to unravel. I mean, just from the sheer standpoint of going from like a completely broken family to the point that you're like sleeping on people's porches and cardboard boxes in hospital hallways, not even being able to afford to live in an apartment because you got evicted and sleeping in your car when Nevermind came out, to having millions of dollars overnight and beating Michael Jackson on the charts at the top, and then he meets Courtney Love and falls in love, and she gets pregnant within 3 or 4 months, and he starts doing heroin habitually at the same time. Even the most well-adjusted person, I argue, could barely handle that, and Kurt was certainly not the most well-adjusted person. So as I said, he has chronic pain, heroin addiction, and a toxic relationship with fame itself here. and the pressure to follow up Nevermind becomes just unbearable, as I imagine it must have been. So Kurt makes a decision that will define the rest of Nirvana's career, which unfortunately is very short, but he decides the next album will not be friendly, and it will not be a Nevermind 2, which obviously sets the stage for a lot of conflict and a lot of issues in different ways. So let's move on to In Utero here. Kurt doesn't want another Nevermind. He doesn't want polish. He wants the opposite. He doesn't want accessibility. He doesn't want mass appeal. What he wants is honesty, even if it costs them their audience. So, because he liked the Pixies so much and their sound, he hires Steve Albini, and Steve Albini did do those Pixies records that he loved, like Surfer Rosa. So Steve is known for abrasive recordings, confrontational opinions, and a complete lack of interest in commercial success. So obviously this is not an accident, this is a statement, and if Nevermind was Nirvana accidentally becoming the biggest band in the world, In Utero would be Nirvana trying to remind everyone, including themselves, who they really were. And that's where the debate truly begins. Now it should also be noted here that Kurt had even wilder ideas of In Utero than what it actually turned out to be. In his journals, he wrote at one point that he wanted to release, I believe it was an 8-track only version of In Utero first. Like, that's all you could get was an 8-track version, and the recordings were like on a boombox. And then after like a week or two, it became like a cassette version also was available, and that would sound slightly cleaner. And then after like a month, the CD version would come out, which was like perfect quality and sounded better. And if they had actually done that, like, that would have been absolutely amazing. And I really wish they had done that, but it was scrapped, obviously, for probably practicality reasons. But another crazy thing is, if you know the song Moist Vagina by Nirvana, in the chorus, he just sits saying marijuana over and over again. Thurston Moore heard the rough demos, and he said that should be the first song on the album. And that song didn't even make it on the album in the end, but, like, could you imagine if they had done that in 1993? I mean, like, it's just insane, some of these ideas that were batted around. Like, I kind of wish both of those ideas had been implemented, though, just because it would have been, like, another catastrophic bomb going off in the universe. But anyway, so for In Utero, from the moment it begins, it's clear Nirvana is no longer interested in making anybody comfortable. They're not going to make a Nevermind 2. They're not going to hold your hand to, like, poppy, grungy melodies. The opening track, even, Serve the Servants, starts with a guitar tone that's brittle and exposed, basically feedback. There's no grand entrance, no attempt to ease the listener in. And then Kurt's first lines, he goes, "Teenage angst has paid off well, now I'm bored and old." And that's one of the most blunt, self-aware lines he ever wrote. So this is not going to be a celebration of success. It's more like an autopsy, right? Which, unfortunately, months later would be proven to be darker and more correct than people realize. But just describing the album, it sounds more like you're getting like a psychoanalysis of somebody, right? So immediately, Serve the Servants reframes everything Nirvana did with Nevermind. Fame isn't empowering anymore. It's exhausting. It's alienating. It's something that happened to him, not something he chose. And that tension between control and loss of control pretty much defines In Utero. And the sound of In Utero, let's get into that. Steve Albini's production is often described as raw, but that word doesn't really fully capture what's happening here. This album sounds like a band exposed. The drums are loud and unpolished, recorded in a way that emphasizes the room tone rather than the performance. The guitars feel sharp, almost hostile. Kurt's vocals are dry, intimate, and there's like no effects on them. And then sometimes they're just unsettlingly close, really. They sound like something off of Bleach. There's no warm polish here, no glow, no smoothing of the edges. Even in the singles that were remixed slightly by Scott Litt, they're still pretty darn abrasive. So every imperfection here is preserved. Albini doesn't try to make Nirvana sound bigger than life. He makes them sound human and sometimes very ugly. But that ugliness is the point of the record. I mean, that raw guitar tone that Kurt employs on every song, and I believe he's using the Sands amp for that, which is a different distortion than he used on Nevermind. It's almost like a chainsaw, right? I mean, it's not like hummable, radio-friendly pop songs like Nevermind. It's more like somebody has a guitar, they have it turned up to like 11, the amp sounds like it's overheating, and he's like trying to cut your head off with it. Basically, it's like a chainsaw, right? I mean, that's the sound of In Utero. That's what he wanted, and he definitely got that. But therein lies the contradiction in what was going to happen after this when it came out. So The ugliness is basically the point of the album. So when Nevermind invited listeners In Utero almost challenges them to stay away. So now Heart-Shaped Box is the closest In Utero song that comes to a traditional single, but even that is pretty deceptive. On the surface, the song is a little bit melodic, the chorus soars, the structure is familiar, it's the same formula, but the imagery in the lyrics are pretty dark, even for Kurt. There's umbilical nooses, cancer metaphors, consumption and control, and this is like the opposite of a love song in any conventional sense, you know. There's obsession, dependency, entrapment, which is sort of intimate in a way, I guess, in like a Stockholm Syndrome type of way. This contradiction perfectly represents In Utero as a whole. There's hooks, but then there's punishment for enjoying the hooks almost, because there's abrasive songs that are just refusing to be palatable in any way. Now, Nevermind had these songs too. I think people forget that. There's songs like Territorial Pissings and Stay Away that are still very abrasive, and if you had the bonus copy on your album, you had Endless Nameless, and those songs are obviously pretty abrasive, and they're not really holding your hand, but there's no poly here, there's no, Come As You Are, there's no polishing of rough edges. There's Dumb, which is a great song, but also very dark lyrically if you look at it closely, and that's structurally similar to Polly. But there's All Apologies, which is catchy, but again, very dark in terms of lyric, and the sound has lots of feedback and that kind of thing. But then there's also tracks like Senseless Apprentice and Milk It, and these just feel like intentionally abrasive and radio-friendly unit shifter, that sort of stuff. They're repetitive, they're chaotic, they're confrontational. Senseless Apprentice is built around screaming and pounding drums, basically, and weirdly was inspired by Patrick Susskind's Perfume, a very dark novel about obsession, disgust, murder, all this stuff. So this just sounds completely unhinged because it's basically meant to sound unhinged. And Milk It, in particular, might be the most uncomfortable song Nirvana ever recorded. Paper Cuts is definitely up there too, though. The lyrics are fragmented and grotesque. The rhythm lurches unpredictably. There's no stable ground for you to stand on. You just kind of get shoved around from craziness to craziness. So this is basically Nirvana rejecting like the idea that music has to be pleasant to be meaningful, and it's almost rejecting like the entire music industry with songs like Radio Friendly Unit Shifter, right? So, and that brings us to Rate Me. Rate Me is one of the most controversial songs in Nirvana's catalog, and also one of the most misunderstood, at least by mainstream listeners. The title alone, immediately makes it radioactive, especially in 1993. The song is not about endorsing violence, though. It's about powerlessness and about violation, emotional, physical, cultural. Kurt repeatedly stated that the song was anti-rape, anti-abuse, and anti-exploitation, and yet it was constantly misinterpreted, which only reinforced the album's central frustration. People still weren't listening, they were reacting, they were consuming, they were missing the point again. And then All Apologies closes In Utero not with rage, but with resignation. The song feels weary, gentle, almost detached. What else should I be? All apologies. It doesn't sound like forgiveness, it sounds like exhaustion. This isn't like the triumphant ending of a rock record. It's the sound of someone running out of energy to fight the narrative surrounding them. If something in the way was a warming, nice piece of pie that was a little bit disturbing, All Apologies feels like acceptance, right? And that's devastating in hindsight, given that this was the last album song that Kurt released while he was alive. So In Utero overall, what is it trying to do? It's not trying to be loved, it's trying to be honest. It's a record about bodily pain, emotional decay, unwanted fame, and the discomfort of being seen. Nevermind, unified a generation. In Utero fractured it intentionally. Some fans felt alienated, some critics were confused, some people checked out entirely, and Nirvana was okay with that. Or at least Kurt wanted to be. I'm sure that it somewhat ate at him that it sold less than Nevermind, but nevertheless, that's what happened. So what are we actually arguing about here? Nevermind versus In Utero. When people argue about one versus the other, they're usually not just arguing about music. They're arguing about values, because these albums represent two completely different ideas of what art is supposed to do. Nevermind believes that music can connect people, change the world, be revolutionary, be catchy but heavy at the same time, and it's okay to be confused. But In Utero, in many ways, is more honest because it believes music should tell the truth, even if that truth isolates you. Nevermind is Kurt reaching out to the world in many ways. In Utero, he's reaching into the world, I feel. It's very, inward record in many ways. Neither is wrong, right? They're just very contradictory approaches. So Nevermind is accessible by design, even if it wasn't meant to be quite as accessible as it ended up being. The songs are structured, the hooks are undeniable, the production invites repeat listening. It's an album you can stumble into accidentally and still understand emotionally. In Utero does not offer that courtesy. It demands attention, it demands patience, and sometimes it demands discomfort. Nevermind even asks, do you feel like this too? But In Utero more is like, can you handle how this actually feels? So now if we're talking about impact on the world, Nevermind wins immediately, sales-wise, fame-wise, commercial-wise. Nevermind obviously is the one. It's the album that honestly in the 90s wouldn't really exist in the way that it does without it. It reshaped rock radio, it ended an era and opened a new era. It opened doors for many, many artists that would never have been given a chance otherwise. There's no grunge boom without Nevermind, for example, no alternative mainstream without Nevermind. But cultural impact is not the same thing as personal impact. In Utero did not change the world in nearly the same way, but it documented the cost of changing it on Kurt Cobain, basically. For listeners who found Nevermind exciting, In Utero was alienating, right? But for listeners who found Nevermind overwhelming, In Utero was a lifeline in some ways. And that brings us to the Kurt Cobain question. The hardest part of this debate really is separating the music from the person who made it, because when you listen to In Utero, you're not just hearing an album, you're basically hearing a man struggling to survive the thing that made him famous, which doesn't automatically make In Utero better, but it does make it heavier, especially emotionally, not just the sound of the record. Nevermind feels like possibility, In Utero feels like the consequences of your actions in some ways. Knowing how Nirvana's story ends makes that contrast impossible to ignore, because the mentions of death, disease, unhappiness, nihilism, way more prevalent, I would argue, on In Utero than Nevermind. Nevermind is more like, I'm confused, but let's write a song about it and try to get other people into our band, right? But In Utero is like, I've seen it all, I hate it all, I'm sick of it all, here's 3 minutes of feedback. I mean, it's not exactly that simple, but if you had to distill it down into a couple sentences, that would be a good starting place. So which album is better? If better means tighter songwriting, broader appeal, and lasting cultural influence, obviously Nevermind wins. It's the better album in those terms. But if better means emotional honesty, artistic risk, and refusal to compromise, then you have to say that In Utero is the better album. And if you're being honest with yourself, your answer probably says more about where you are in life than about the albums themselves. And we shouldn't forget here, I know that's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but that's the truth. I mean, Nevermind is the stuff you would want to play to get someone into Nirvana. In Utero is what you would play once they were already into Nirvana and wanted more. I just, as an album itself, I guess, song by song, you have to say Nevermind is slightly better. Just because I feel like there's a little more filler type songs on In Utero. Like Tourette's, Milk It, Very Ape. But song for song, it's almost the same, because In Utero also has Heart-Shaped Box, Rape Me, Dumb, All Apologies. Those are 4 really big Nirvana songs. Penny Royalty, that's already 5 of the 12, are pretty big Nirvana songs. So, but the rest of Nirvana's catalog we should also talk about here really quickly. It's worth acknowledging everything that Nirvana left behind, right? You got Incesticide, which everyone always overlooks, but it really does bridge from Bleach to Nevermind with songs like Sliver, Dive, Aneurysm. Those songs are literally, you could see exactly where Nirvana was going to go when you listen to those songs. There's raw chaos on that album. There's B-sides, experiments, covers, and there's your proof, basically, that Nirvana was never as simple as their biggest hits made them seem. Unplugged in New York, of course, a classic album, very sad to listen to, unfortunately, but everything is down to its core. There's hardly any distortion, no noise, just Kurt vulnerably singing to you, and if you watch the video with it, it's even more uncomfortable almost and intimate. So, and then from the Muddy Banks of the Wishkah captured their live chaos. The numerous live albums they've released since Kurt left this earth are, they're out there for everyone to hear, and you can hear how aggressive and kind of all over the place the band was live. And then, of course, there's the interesting demos, outtakes, that kind of stuff that Kurt was recording even after In Utero. Like You Know You're Right is an insane record to listen to, and Do Re Mi is just like amazing to listen to. It really makes you wonder what else he might have wanted to record. So in closing, really, Nirvana, this debate's never going to end. I mean, you're always going to have people that like indie rock, that like more abrasive stuff, that are like In Utero is the way to go, and you're going to have the more mainstream people saying, how could you ever not pick Nevermind? It's so perfect and concise and so hooky. But we'll never know for sure what Kurt really even preferred in terms of just what he liked better, because Nirvana didn't have the time to evolve. They didn't get a long career arc. They didn't get reinvention eras. They didn't get closure. It was like it was a shooting star. They burned fast, bright, and then they burned out. So that's why we're still arguing to this day, because Nevermind shows us what Nirvana meant to the world, and In Utero, sadly, in many ways, shows us what the world did to Nirvana and Kurt Cobain. So, in closing, I hope you enjoyed the video. Sorry if there was any bad ad-libs or mistakes. Like I said, I did this all in one take, so there probably are some rambling sections and that sort of thing, but I'm a huge fan of the band, if you can't already tell. So I'll ask you the same question fans have been asking for over 30 years. If you could only keep one, Nevermind or In Utero? Tell me why in the comments. And if you made it this far, thanks for listening. Hit that like button and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.